Okay, so it's yet another installment in my introduction to the basic logical skills that you'll need for this class. So this time around, we're going to be looking at the concept of a conditional. We'll just quickly review where we've gotten so far in our big concepts. First are ways of describing arguments, right? So we've got valid arguments. A valid argument has a good structure, which means that it's impossible for the conclusion to be false when we assume the premises to be true. And if that's the case, if there's no way of assuming premise 1 and premise 2 of an argument, for instance, without also having to accept the conclusion, well, if that happens, then you've got a valid argument. But if you can imagine the conclusion to be false, even when you suppose the premises to be true, then you've got an invalid argument, right? So this is the idea that an argument has to have good structure. We also pointed out that also you need to have true premises in your arguments, right? So you want to have a valid argument, an argument with good structure, but also good premises themselves. So you want a valid argument plus none of the premises are false. And because of this setup, we're saying, look, if all the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true. This says it's valid plus we've got true premises, which means that the conclusions of sound arguments have to be true. There's no such thing as a sound argument that isn't also valid, and there isn't such thing as a sound argument with a false conclusions. All sound arguments have true conclusions. We also looked at the concept of necessary and sufficient conditions. So there we found a necessary condition is a precondition or an inevitable consequence of another condition. So if I say X is necessary for Y, I mean that anytime you have Y, you're also going to have X coming along with it. So for instance, I might say, let's say, being a mammal is necessary for being a dog, right? Anytime it's true that you've got a dog in the house, it's also got to be true that you've got a mammal in the house, right? We could do other conditions as well, right? It might be, let's see, death is a necessary consequence of falling from the top story of the Empire State Building, which means that anytime you fall from the top of the Empire State Building, you're going to lose your life, right? And this is different from a sufficient condition, because when I say that X is sufficient for Y, we're talking about a guarantee, which means any time that it's true that X, it's also going to be true that Y, right? So here, we wouldn't say that, death is sufficient for falling off the Empire State Building, right? It's not the case that everybody who died because they fell off the Empire State Building. Unfortunately, there are all sorts of ways to die, right? And it actually goes the other way. So when we think about the relationship between being a dog and being a mammal, where being a mammal is necessary for being a dog, when we go to sufficiency, we say being a dog is sufficient for being a mammal, right? So when we think about sufficient conditions, we're talking about a guarantee. All right, that's our quick recap. Let's move on to a new concept for today. So conditionals. Many philosophical arguments use these kinds of statements, and what we're doing with a conditional is what philosophers like to call creating a compound sentence, right? So for instance, I can take a small sentence and then I can use a logical connective. So a conditional is one kind of logical connectives. You can also use things like and or, right? So you can take a simple sentence like Bo is a dog, and then you can put an and then say Bo is a mammal, right? So then you have a complex sentence that says Bo is a dog and Bo is a mammal, right? Well, conditional sentences are like this too, and it's sort of like instead of putting an and between two sentences, you're putting an if blank, then blank to tie two sentences together. So we're going to use my dog as the perennial example again. So we say, if Bo is a dog, that's your one small unit of a sentence, then Bo is a mammal. So we take two little sentences and plug them together to make a bigger, more complex sentence, right? The idea is that these sorts of sentences can be really helpful in helping us to develop philosophical arguments. Because you can take any two sentences and plug them into each half of the conditional and make these if-then sentences. I'll give you just two little technical terms. The front half of the sentence is called the antecedent. So the Bo is a dog, if Bo is a dog, that's the antecedent. And the back half of the sentence, this right-hand side of the sentence, is called the consequent, which makes sense. It's like the consequence of this, right? If Bo is a dog, then the consequence of that is that he is a mammal. So how do we figure out whether a conditional is true or not? Well, this actually connects closely to our ideas of necessary and sufficient conditions from earlier. Because if a conditional sentence is true, the antecedent is sufficient for the consequent, right? So looking back at this sentence, we're saying that if we've got a true conditional, because like we could plug any number of sentences into each half of the sentence. It's just that a lot of randomly chosen sentences are going to be things that will create false conditionals, right? So, you could put the sentence, if the sun is shining today, then the moon is made out of cheese, right? But you could put any two random sentences in. But when you have a true conditional, then the antecedent is going to be sufficient for the consequent, right? So we're saying if you have a true conditional, the first half of your conditional sentence will guarantee the truth of the second half of your conditional, right? So, I'm just using the letters P and Q to sub in for any other little sentence that we might stick in. But if I'm saying if P then Q, I'm saying that the truth of P guarantees the truth of Q. And we can also say that if a conditional is true, the consequent is necessarily the case when the antecedent is true. So if I say if P then Q is true, it means that Q has to be true whenever it's the case that P, right? If P, then Q is guaranteed, or Q necessarily follows from P. That's all right within the wheelhouse of our talk about necessary and sufficient conditions from the last little video that you saw. And here's the thing. If a conditional is false, then you can imagine the antecedent being true, but the consequent being false, right? Because basically, if you say if P then Q, you're saying that P guarantees Q. Well, the way that you know that a guarantee isn't the case is to, see the first thing happening, but never seeing the second thing happening. So let's compare some examples, because our idea is if a conditional is false, you can imagine the antecedent being true, but the consequent being false. Well, if Bo is a dog, then Bo is a mammal. Well, when we think about this, it's actually pretty much impossible, unless you get really weird and crazy with your imagination. But we can kind of recognize that it's impossible for something to be a dog but not being a mammal, right? So this first sentence here, if Bo is a dog, then Bo is a mammal, that's a true conditional, right? It's a true if-then statement. But if we look at the second one, if Felix is a mammal, then Felix is a dog. Well, again, see if you can imagine something being a mammal but not being a dog, right? So in this case, we can imagine that Felix is a cat or a mouse or a human, right? And if that's right, then we can imagine the antecedent being true with the consequent still being false. So that's a false conditional, right? If Rover is a dog, he is tan-colored. Well, again, we can imagine a dog named Rover who is black or white or blonde rather than tan-colored, right? So we're imagining the antecedent true, but the consequent false. So that is a false conditional. Now, a trick that you can use for conditionals, you just saw me using it, really, is to come up with a thing that a philosopher calls a counterexample. So imagine that the antecedent is true, but the consequent is false. If you can do that, then the conditional is false. And if you can be specific about what you've imagined, then you've sort of demonstrated the falsity of that conditional. So this is that skill that philosophers use called giving counterexamples, right? So an example, if it can fly, then it must be a bug. That came up in our valid arguments discussion already. So this is obviously an absurd conditional, right? But what do you do when somebody says something crazy like this? Well, you give them an example to show that the capacity of flight does not guarantee that you're a bug, right? You say, but birds can fly, and they definitely aren't bugs. Airplanes can fly, and they're not bugs, right? So the whole strategy is to show exactly how a certain kind of guarantee fails by giving these examples that we come up with using our imaginations. So let's just wrap up. I'm going to give you some examples, and then I'll talk you through whether these are true or false conditionals. And if they're false conditionals, we'll also sort of talk about like strategies for coming up with counterexamples. So here's the first one. If you're north of Charlotte, then you are in New York City. Now, remember, if this is a true conditional, then it would be impossible to imagine the antecedent true and the consequent false, right? That basically, when you have a true antecedent, the consequent also has to be the case. But it might occur to you that this is definitely a false conditional, because many of you are north of the city of Charlotte right now, but you're also not in New York City. So I'm recording this in my apartment in Winston-Salem, which is north of Charlotte, but I'm not in New York City. So this is a false conditional for that reason, right? Now, if we actually flipped it around, we could see that then it would be a true conditional. So if we said, if you are in New York City, then you are north of Charlotte, right? It's impossible to imagine a person who is in New York City and not also north of Charlotte at the same time. Here's another one. If you are a widower, then you must have been married first. Well, you have to know what the concept widower means, right? A widower is a man whose spouse has died, right? But then we think, okay, well, it's impossible to be a widower unless you had a spouse, and you can only have a spouse if you have been married at some point in your life, right? And when we think about it that way, we realize that it's impossible for the antecedent to be true and the consequent to be false. That is to say, whenever you have a widower, that's a person who must have been married at some earlier time. So that's a true conditional. If there's a cat in the room, there is a former kitten in the room. So we think to ourselves, okay, so imagine that there's a cat in the room that you're sitting in right now. Maybe there is one. Then you have to think, is that being a former kitten? You might think to yourself, yeah, it's not like cats just like pop into existence out of thin air. So this is true, right? It's impossible to imagine a cat being in the room without there being a former kitten in the room. Compare it with this one. If you own a cat, you must have once owned a kitten. Can we imagine somebody who owns a cat but who has never owned a kitten? And I can imagine that, right? Because you can imagine somebody who adopts an adult cat, right? Definitely not a kitten anymore. This person, having adopted it, now owns the cat. But did never and has never owned a kitten. So we've got a counterexample, so that's a false conditional. Last one. If an animal stands on two legs when full grown and healthy, then it must be a human. Can you think of an example to that one, or a counterexample to that one? Can you imagine something that is standing on full legs, two legs, when full grown and healthy, but which is not a human? Well, if you thought of birds, then you realize that standing on two legs when you're full grown and healthy is not a guarantee that you've got a human, right? So, this goes back to the ancient Greeks even. There was a fellow named Diogenes the Skeptic. Some other philosophers said that they had a definition of what it is to be a human being, what it is to be a man, and they came up with the definition, well, a man is a bipedal, two-footed, two-legged animal. And Diogenes said, oh yeah? Well, what about right over here, I have a chicken in my hand. And so the other philosophers said, well, okay, fine, our definition of a human is a featherless bipedal animal. And Diogenes goes ahead and plucks the chicken, holds it above his head, and says, behold, a man! Right? But, the humor of that aside, we can see that that's the sort of thing that we do when we do philosophy, right? If somebody tries to give us a definition or a claim that if you have one thing, then you definitely meet another condition, well, part of what we do as philosophers is try to come up with examples that seem to raise trouble for those assertions. So that's going to wrap it up for our little introduction to conditionals. The big thing you need to know is that it's an if-then statement where the antecedent guarantees the truth of the consequent, and that if you have a false conditional, then you can imagine the antecedent true but the consequent false. So that's going to do it for this one. Thanks for listening in, and we'll have one more tutorial video on logic within this series. Thanks.